I'm all in.
I don't believe it. I don't believe it. Phil Ivey just went all in with a 5-deuce offsuit.
I thought you were just angry at Barry.
I am.
That is one of the great bluffs in the history of high-stakes poker.
August 2012, a high-stakes Baccarat table in Atlantic City. Across the felt, a pile of chips worth hundreds of thousands sits untouched. Casino staff exchange nervous glances. They've been watching for hours, yet something feels off. At the center of it all is Phil Ivey, calm as ever. The man is a machine. No expression, no tells, just that same unshakable presence that's earned him the respect and fear of gamblers worldwide. His companion, a quiet Chinese woman, leans in and whispers to the dealer in Mandarin. The request seems harmless. A card turned a certain way, just as it's been done all night. The dealer obliges. After all, what's the harm in a little superstition? The casino doesn't know it yet, but they've already lost. What's unfolding isn't a simple case of good luck or a hot streak, it's something far more calculated, a method so subtle, so invisible, that even now, as the chips stack up in front of him, no one suspects a thing. Not yet. Ivey doesn't cheat. That's what makes this so interesting. He doesn't need to. His poker career alone has proven he can dismantle opponents without tricks, without gimmicks, just sheer ability. But tonight, this is different. Casinos aren't used to losing. They let the occasional whale win because sooner or later, the house always gets it back. That's how the game works. But what happens when the whale isn't gambling at all? When every decision, every bet, every perfectly timed increase is backed by an edge so powerful, the casino doesn't even realize it's happening. This isn't just another gambling story. This is the moment Phil Ivey broke the system. But here's the real question. Was it brilliance or was it cheating? Casinos say he manipulated the game, courts agreed, but Ivey? He walked into their world, played by their rules, and left with over $20 million. And if that's cheating, then why did they let him play in the first place? To understand the full picture, you have to go back. Back to the meeting that set it all in motion. Back to the moment when one of the world's most legendary poker players was introduced to a woman who saw gambling the way a hunter sees prey. Back to the night Phil Ivey made a deal that would change everything. It started, as these things often do, with an introduction, a mutual friend, a whispered opportunity, a chance to do something that no one, not even the casinos with their security teams, surveillance cameras, an army of game protection specialists had seen coming. Phil Ivey wasn't looking for an edge, at least not in the way most gamblers are. He wasn't some desperate card sharp lurking in the shadows of a casino floor, waiting for an opening. He was already a legend. By 2012, he had stacked up over $30 million in poker earnings, shattered fields of world-class players, and built a reputation that made even the best think twice before tangling with him in a hand. He didn't need a scheme, he was the scheme. And yet, when the opportunity came knocking, he listened. The woman sitting across from him was not a poker player, but she knew casinos better than most who spent their lives inside them. Kelly Sun. She wasn't famous, but she was feared. In the underground world of high-stakes gambling, she had a reputation for one thing: beating the house. Not through brute force or luck, but through something far more dangerous. She was an edge sorter, one of the very few people in the world who could look at a deck of cards and see what others couldn't. For her, this wasn't just about money, this was revenge. Casinos had humiliated her before, locked her in a cell, seized her winnings, treated her like an afterthought. But Kelly Sun wasn't the type to forget. She had spent years perfecting her craft, waiting for the right moment to strike back. What she needed wasn't just skill, she already had that. What she needed was access, and Phil Ivey was her golden ticket. She laid it out in careful detail, a way to tilt the odds in their favor without marking cards, without colluding with dealers, without breaking a single law. A strategy that, if executed correctly, would allow them to win with the same inevitability that a casino expected from its players. Edge sorting, a technique so subtle that most people, even seasoned gamblers, wouldn't notice it happening. Most casinos certainly didn't. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't sleight of hand. It was simply paying attention to something that no one else bothered to look at. Here's the flaw. Casino playing cards are supposed to be perfectly symmetrical, identical on all four edges, but in reality, they're not. The manufacturing process, despite its precision, often leaves micro imperfections, patterns that are slightly off-center, edges that are minutely cut at different angles, imperceptible to the average person, but not to Kelly Sun. If she could see which cards had slightly different backs, particularly the most valuable ones in Baccarat, the 8s and 9s, she could track them. and if she could track them, she could know, with near certainty, when to bet big and when to hold back. But there was a problem. Knowing which cards were valuable wasn't enough. She had to control the deck, and in any normal casino, touching the cards in Baccarat was strictly off limits. That's where Ivey came in. He wasn't just another gambler, he was a whale, and when whales make requests, casinos bend over backward to accommodate them. He would set the stage, making demands that only a VIP could get away with. A specific brand of cards, one that Kelly knew had defects, an automatic shuffler to ensure that the cards stayed in their original orientation rather than being manually shuffled and flipped. A Mandarin-speaking dealer, so Kelly could discreetly tell them when to turn certain cards, under the guise of a harmless superstition. The beauty of it was in its simplicity. The casino would agree to everything, thinking they were just indulging a high roller's eccentricities. And in doing so, they would unknowingly hand Ivey and Kelly the perfect setup. A deck that was now marked, by the dealer no less. A shuffle that kept the cards in place, a pattern that only they could see. If it worked, they wouldn't just win, they would never lose. Ivey listened, he thought about it, considered the risk, the legality, the repercussions. Then he made his decision. They were doing it. The question wasn't whether they could pull it off. That much was already clear. The question was how much they could take before someone noticed. The bait was set. Now, all that was left was for the casinos to take it. Phil Ivey didn't approach the Baccarat or Crockford's as a man looking for a quick score. A man with a $30 million poker resume didn't need to cheat. If anything, he was the perfect high roller. Famous, reckless, willing to bet 6 figures a hand. Casinos dream of players like that. So when he asked for a few reasonable conditions to make his high-stakes Baccarat sessions more enjoyable, there was no hesitation. Casinos had seen stranger superstitions before. Every single request was granted. No one suspected a thing. It was a flawless setup, executed with the same precision that made Ivey one of the most feared poker players in the world. A setup so airtight that even if the casino had reviewed the footage in real time, they wouldn't have seen anything that looked like cheating. There was no collusion, no tampering, no signals between Ivey and Kelly's son. She barely spoke to him during play, and yet every single hand played into their trap. Baccarat is a game built on illusion. It feels like a test of intuition, a battle of momentum, a gambler's duel between player and banker. But in reality, it's one of the purest forms of luck-based gambling there is. The game is designed to strip away skill, to remove the possibility of outplaying an opponent. It's supposed to be a coin flip with a luxury price tag, nothing more. But Ivey doesn't play games where he doesn't have an edge. With Kelly tracking every card that was rotated, they had flipped Baccarat from a guessing game into a calculated attack. Every time an 8 or 9 returned to play, they knew it. And because of the automatic shuffler, that knowledge lasted indefinitely. It wasn't just about spotting a high card. It was about knowing exactly when to press the bet and when to pull back. This is where it gets fascinating. In poker, players have the freedom to extract value from their opponents in an infinite number of ways. Bluffing, pressure, deception, table talk. It's a game of maneuvering. But in a game like Baccarat, where every hand is a structured bet with no ability to deviate, Ivey still managed to manufacture a strategic advantage out of thin air. It was methodical, clinical, ruthless. The first night at the Borgata, they walked away with over $2 million in profit. The casino didn't blink. Why would they? Whales sometimes can win. In fact, it was a good thing. A high-profile victory from a poker icon was free advertising. Every amateur with a gambling itch would come running, hoping to capture a fraction of that magic. So they invited him back. A month later, he returned. This time, another $1,600,000. Again, no red flags. Casinos don't panic over short-term variance. Then came the third visit, $4,700,000. Now, things were getting uncomfortable. By the time they finished their last session, their total winnings at the Borgata had climbed to nearly $10 million. But it wasn't just the money that stung, it was how effortless it had seemed. For Ivey, this was a masterclass in game selection. Poker players talk about edge all the time. How to spot it, how to maximize it, how to push it to its absolute limit. This was a live demonstration of what happens when an edge is so powerful that the concept of losing becomes irrelevant. But even the greatest setups don't last forever. And in London, things took a turn. Crockford's had no idea what had happened in Atlantic City, but they were about to learn the hard way. When Ivey and Kelly's son arrived, the terms were the same. Same requests, same setup, same methodical execution. It worked. Of course it worked. Over the course of multiple sessions, they crushed the house for £12 million, more than $20 million. Then, something changed. On the final night, with the casino already reeling, they made a rare mistake. The dealer switched the deck. In poker, adaptability is everything. Even the best laid plans have to shift when the dynamics change. But in Baccarat, where the entire operation was built around a specific setup, the sudden introduction of a fresh deck was a death sentence for the system. There was no conversation, no hesitation. The moment the new cards hit the felt, Ivey and Kelly's son did something that, in hindsight, sealed their fate. They stood up, cashed out, and walked away. To the casino staff watching, it was an incredibly unusual move, the kind of move that makes security pause and think, why? It was a moment of pure psychology. If a high roller is simply riding a lucky wave, why leave mid-session? Why not play another few hands, keep the momentum going? Unless, of course, something had changed. Casinos are designed to make losing feel inevitable. The house edge isn't just a math equation, it's a psychological weapon, an invisible force that keeps gamblers convinced that one more bet, one more spin, one more deal could turn things around. And yet, here was Ivey, abandoning a winning streak for no apparent reason. Crockfords didn't react immediately. They processed his cash-out request, they let him leave. But once the adrenaline wore off, once the numbers were tallied, and once the security team sat down to review every second of footage, the doubts started creeping in. Something wasn't right. And when they pieced it together, when they saw the pattern, when they realized what had actually happened at that table, they refused to pay him a single cent. Phil Ivey wasn't the type to leave money on the table, and yet, that's exactly what happened. £12 million neatly stacked in front of him, left behind as he and Kelly's son walked away without so much as a backward glance. They hadn't lost. They hadn't been escorted out. No casino manager had asked them to stop playing. But the moment the new deck hit the felt, the game was over, and they knew it. At first, no one suspected a thing. Casinos thrive on high-variance gamblers, and streaks, good or bad, are part of the business. A player winning big over several sessions wasn't unheard of. And in fact, it was a necessary part of the illusion. After all, if no one ever won, why would anyone play? But something about this win was different. It wasn't just the size of the number, it was the way it happened, the way the bets were placed, the way Ivey played with absolute confidence, never second-guessing a wager. It wasn't normal. And that's when the real scrutiny began. Surveillance footage was pulled, every second of every session reviewed. At first there was nothing unusual, no collusion, no marked cards, no irregular behavior from the dealer. But then, a pattern emerged, so subtle, so well orchestrated that it almost slipped past unnoticed. The Mandarin-speaking dealer, the request to rotate certain cards, the fact that the high-value cards, 8s and 9s, always seemed to be the ones that were turned. That was the moment someone in security must have said it out loud. They weren't just playing, they were tracking the deck. It's one thing to lose money in a casino, it's another thing entirely to feel like you've been played, and that's exactly how Crockfords felt. The moment they connected the dots, they did something casinos rarely do. They broke the unspoken rule of high-stakes gambling. They refused to pay. Ivey was informed that his winnings were under review. What that really meant was they weren't planning to hand over a single penny. The £12 million still sitting in his account. Locked, frozen, no cash out, no check, just an apologetic but firm explanation that the casino was launching an investigation. For a poker player like Ivey, this was a familiar move, but one that was never supposed to be used against him. Casinos pull this trick all the time on small-time advantage players. A blackjack player wins too much, suddenly they're no longer welcome. A slot machine pays out a jackpot that's too big. A malfunction, a technicality, a reason to withhold the money. It's the house's way of reminding players who's really in charge. But this wasn't some unknown card counter. This was Phil Ivey. He wasn't about to let this go quietly. Most gamblers, when faced with a casino refusing to pay, walk away. They know the legal system favors the house, and fighting it is a financial black hole. But Ivey wasn't just another gambler, and this wasn't just another night at the tables. £12 million wasn't just a payday, it was a challenge. So he did something no one expected. He sued. The lawsuit was unprecedented, a world-class poker player taking one of the most exclusive casinos in London to court over a Baccarat game. It sounded ridiculous. Casinos aren't supposed to be the ones defending themselves in these situations. They're supposed to be the ones making accusations, banning players, calling in gaming commissions to protect their bottom line. But Ivey knew something that every professional gambler understands. The house always wins, unless you force them to play a game they can't control. And in a courtroom, the rules were different. Crockford's didn't back down. They argued that what Ivey had done wasn't just an advantage play, it was a violation of fair play. That he had manipulated the game by requesting conditions that gave him an unfair edge, effectively breaking the unspoken contract between casino and player. Ivey didn't deny what he had done. He didn't have to. Instead, his argument was simple. He had played within the casino's rules. They had agreed to every condition. They had willingly let him play under those circumstances, and only when he won did they decide it wasn't fair. The case went to trial in 2014, and the ruling, a disaster for Ivey. The judge acknowledged that Ivey had not acted dishonestly, that there was no fraud, no cheating. He had done exactly what he claimed, exploited a flaw in the system. But despite that, the ruling came down in favor of Crockford's. The casino was not obligated to pay him a single penny because, according to the court, even without dishonesty, what he did amounted to cheating under civil law. In other words, he wasn't a criminal, but he still wasn't getting paid. It was a landmark ruling, one that sent shockwaves through the gambling world. Because if Ivey wasn't allowed to collect his winnings, then where was the line? At what point does an edge become too good for a casino to honor their losses? And more importantly, if the roles were reversed, would the casino have refunded his money if he had lost under the same conditions? The answer, of course, was no. Casinos don't refund gamblers who lose on bad rulings. They don't give back money when a player goes on tilt, or when a dealer makes a mistake that benefits the house. There is no fair play when the odds are in the casino's favor. There is only the expectation that gamblers will accept their losses and move on. But when the house loses, suddenly, fair play is sacred. The ruling wasn't just a blow to Ivey, it was a warning to every advantage player out there. Find an edge, exploit a flaw, outthink the system, and the house will change the rules before they ever let you collect. And for Ivey, the battle wasn't over, because across the Atlantic, another casino was watching closely, the Baccarat in Atlantic City, and they weren't just refusing to pay, they wanted their money back. Phil Ivey had already lost the battle in London. The UK courts had ruled against him. His £12 million payday vanished, and the precedent was set. Casinos didn't have to honour their losses if they decided after the fact that a player's advantage was too sharp. That alone was a stunning outcome, but the war wasn't over, because across the Atlantic, another casino had been paying very close attention. Baccarat wasn't just watching the case unfold, they were waiting for an opening. Ivey had taken nearly $10 million from them over multiple sessions, using the same edge sorting technique that had just been deemed cheating under civil law in the UK. But unlike Crockford's, Baccarat had already paid him. They hadn't stopped him at the cashier's cage. They hadn't locked down his account. The money was long gone. So they did the only thing they could do. They sued him to get it back. On paper, it was a ridiculous situation. A casino willingly lets a player bet under certain conditions, pays him his winnings, and then years later decides he wasn't entitled to them. That's not just unprecedented, it's the kind of thing that should send a chill down the spine of every high-stakes gambler on the planet, because if the Baccarat won, it meant casinos could effectively retroactively declare a game invalid whenever they lost too much money. This was different from Crockford's. The UK case had been about whether the casino had to pay out winnings that were still in their possession. This question mark. This was about rewriting history. Ivey wasn't about to roll over. His argument remained the same. He didn't cheat. He didn't mark the cards. He didn't collude with a dealer. He simply noticed something the casino didn't and used that information to bet more effectively. That wasn't fraud. That was just being smarter than the house. And really, that's what made the Baccarat case so much more dangerous. This wasn't about punishing a scam artist. This was about punishing someone for being too good. But the casino had an advantage this time. The UK ruling gave them ammunition. If edge sorting had been legally classified as cheating in London, why should it be any different in Atlantic City? They painted a picture of a player who had manipulated the game without the casino realizing it, exploiting the house in a way that went beyond normal gambling. That last part was key. The Baccarat didn't just want their money back, they wanted to set an example. This wasn't just about Phil Ivey. It was a message to every professional gambler, every sharp, every edge seeker who thought they could outplay the system. The house doesn't lose, and if it does, it will find a way to make sure it never happens again. For all of Ivey's success in poker, for all of his experience reading opponents, maneuvering through high-stakes situations and staying ahead of the curve, this was something different. This wasn't a cash game. This wasn't a tournament. This was a fight on the casino's terms, in a courtroom, where the rules weren't dictated by logic or game theory, but by who had more power. The case dragged on for years. The casino claimed he had fundamentally changed the nature of the game by using an advantage that wasn't available to every player. Ivey countered that he had done nothing the casino hadn't willingly agreed to. It was the same debate that had played out in the poker world for decades. When does an edge cross the line from strategy into cheating? It's the same question people asked when online poker exploded. Was using HUDs unfair? What about multi-accounting? What about real-time assistance? And more importantly, who gets to decide? The players, the industry, the courts. For Ivey, this wasn't just about $10 million, it was about defending the very idea of advantage play. The same way a blackjack player counts cards, the same way a sharp bettor exploits bad sportsbook lines, the same way an elite poker pro picks their spots using information that isn't available to the average player. But the court wasn't a poker table. In 2016, a judge ruled against Ivey. It wasn't fraud, they said, but it was a violation of casino contract law. In other words, even if Ivey had played cleanly, even if he had simply used his observational skills, he had still manipulated the game beyond its intended form. And that meant Baccarat was entitled to get their money back. The decision set off a firestorm. Poker players, gamblers, and industry veterans were outraged. The entire premise of gambling is risk. The casino sets the terms, the player accepts those terms, and both sides live with the results. If the player wins, the casino pays. That's the unspoken contract that keeps the whole system alive. But that contract had just been rewritten. If edge sorting was an unfair advantage, what about card counting? What about game selection? What about table conditions that favor the player? At what point does a winning player become a problem player? For years, Ivey fought the ruling, appealing at every level, but in the end, it didn't matter. The courts had already decided. Baccarat had won a judgment for the full $10 million, and they were going to collect. In 2019, they made their first move. They tracked down an entirely separate case, money that Ivey had tied up in Nevada related to another gambling matter, and seized over $1 million of it. It was a warning shot, a reminder that they were coming for everything. By 2020, the fight was over. Ivey and Baccarat reached a confidential settlement, and just like that, the case was closed. No public details, no victory lap, no final statement, just the quiet understanding that in the end, the house always wins. But here's the part that never sat right with players. If Ivey had lost $10 million using the same conditions, would Baccarat have refunded him? Would they have stopped the game, apologized for the mistake, and wired his money back? Of course not. That's the problem with fair play in a casino. It's only fair when they're the ones winning. Phil Ivey didn't just lose a legal battle, he lost something bigger, the illusion of control. In poker, the best players operate under one fundamental principle: play within the rules, but push every edge available. It's why top pros study bet sizing, body language, hand distributions. It's why they exploit mistakes mercilessly. The game isn't about fairness, it's about navigating an environment designed to separate you from your money and finding a way to fight back. Casinos, however, play by a different set of rules, ones that shift depending on who's winning. When a recreational player goes on a heater, when a gambler wins big and cashes out, the house smiles, shakes their hand, and waves them back in. Because eventually, the odds will do their job. Eventually, the money comes back. But Ivey's edge wasn't about short-term variance. It wasn't a run of good luck. It was a calculated, systematic dismantling of a game that was supposed to be unbeatable, and that made him a threat. That's the real reason this case wasn't just another gambling story. It exposed a deeper truth that every serious poker player already knows. Casinos want losers, not gamblers. They don't care if you win occasionally. They don't care if you hit a jackpot or run hot at the blackjack table. But the moment you find a way to win consistently, they don't just take notice, they take action. It's not a coincidence that casinos have spent decades perfecting ways to neutralize skilled players. They use automatic shufflers in blackjack to destroy card counting. They ban advantage bettors from sportsbooks. They track player behavior and quietly remove the ones who don't fit their preferred customer model. And if a game is ever beaten too badly for too long, they kill the game entirely. This wasn't about Ivey cheating. It was about reminding every gambler, professional or otherwise, who really runs the show. And yet, even after losing millions, even after the courts ruled against him, Ivey never apologized, never backed down, never admitted wrongdoing, because from his perspective, he didn't need to. He had done what every great gambler aspires to do. He found a flaw. Casinos rely on the idea that their games are unbeatable, that no system, no strategy, no sharp eye can overcome the built-in house edge. It's why they pump oxygen into the air, why they design their floors like labyrinths, why they offer free drinks to keep players distracted. Everything is designed to make sure the casino has the advantage. And yet, here was a man who had figured out a way to beat them at their own game. That's why players respect Ivey, not because he won millions, but because he did what every gambler dreams of doing. He walked into a casino, played within their rules, and left with all the money. But there was one thing even Phil Ivey couldn't beat. The moment the house realized they had lost, they changed the rules. Because in the end, that's the ultimate reality of gambling. The house doesn't have to beat you, they just have to make sure they never have to pay. For most gamblers, a ruling like this would be the end of the story, a final crushing defeat that serves as a tale. Don't push too hard, don't win too much, and definitely don't think the house plays by the same rules as you. But Phil Ivey isn't most gamblers. The aftermath of the lawsuits should have been a death sentence for his reputation. A court had ruled that he cheated, at least in the eyes of the law. The casinos he once frequented now saw him as a liability, an unspoken blacklist forming in the background. A lesser player, even a great one, might have faded away, the scandal too heavy a burden to carry. And yet, in the poker world, something strange happened. Ivey's mystique didn't diminish, it grew. Because to poker players, this wasn't a story about a fallen hero. It was the story of a man who played a perfect game and still got screwed. Think about it. This wasn't Russ Hamilton rigging online poker games with super user access, peering into opponents' hole cards. This wasn't a backroom collusion scheme where chips were dumped, decks were rigged, or dealers were paid off. There were no hidden signals, no electronic devices, no sleight of hand. He simply observed something the casino didn't, and for that, they erased his winnings. In the years that followed, Ivey all but disappeared from the poker circuit. He still played. High-stakes, private games, the kind where cameras didn't follow, but the era of him being a fixture at every major tournament seemed to be over. Some wondered if he had lost his passion for the game. Others speculated that the legal battles had taken a toll. But the truth, Ivey had nothing left to prove. He had already done it all, crushed the live circuit, dominated the biggest cash games in the world, established himself as one of the greatest to ever touch a deck of cards, and now he had something else. A legacy wrapped in controversy. For some, his name would always carry an asterisk, a footnote in gambling history, a world-class player who crossed the line and paid the price. But for many, he became something else entirely, a symbol of what happens when you're too good for the game you play. And maybe that's why, when he finally made his return to the public poker stage, it wasn't with fanfare. There was no redemption arc, no big interview, no attempt to rewrite the past. He just walked back in, sat down, and started playing again. Phil Ivey wasn't the first gambler to outplay the house, but he might be the last to get away with it, at least for a while. In the wake of his legal battles, casinos weren't just celebrating their victory, they were making changes, security tightened, policies were rewritten. Edge sorting went from an obscure, barely understood technique to something every major casino trained their staff to detect. Dealers were instructed to randomly rotate cards, removing any chance of tracking the deck. Some brands of playing cards even altered their manufacturing processes to ensure the backs were truly symmetrical. Casinos weren't just reacting to Ivey, they were sending a message, because make no mistake, if Ivey had lost, none of this would have happened. The security reviews, the rule changes, the lawsuits, they weren't about preserving the integrity of the game. They were about erasing the moment when for once, the player held all the power. And it wasn't just high-stakes Baccarat that saw a shift. Advantage play across the board took a hit. Card counters, already fighting an uphill battle, saw more casinos install continuous shuffle machines and reduce blackjack payouts to make the game harder to beat. Surveillance on high rollers became more aggressive, not just watching for outright cheating, but tracking who was winning too consistently. Because that was the real lesson from the Ivey case. Casinos don't fear cheaters, they fear winners. And that raises a question that should make every gambler, every poker player, and every person who's ever sat at a casino table think twice. If a player follows the rules, plays by the conditions the casino sets, and still isn't allowed to collect their winnings, was the game ever fair to begin with?